So good morning, Christ Church. Good morning. I think we will begin because indeed there are some in our midst who have been here at church for quite some time this morning, as a matter of fact. Julia needs no introduction to all of you. She has already launched herself out into this work and this ministry of explaining, exploring, that sort of thing. We are delighted that she is this extraordinary resource in our midst, and she will continue her series as it focuses, especially here at Christ Church, on some of the concerns and issues all of us must address. And indeed, Michael Curry, our present presiding bishop, is very seriously engaged in this very work on our racial reconciliation and some of the healing, and the Episcopal Church is undertaking that with vigor and gusto, and the church has called for congregations like Christ Church to do exactly what we're doing. So we are delighted to welcome once again Julia Randle.
Thank you, John, for your very kind introduction. Now, I'm here today to talk about race and Christ Church before the Civil War. That is not a happy topic. It is not an easy topic. It's a very labor-intensive topic because this was a slave society. Alexandria, Virginia, our landscape was a slave society. And slavery set the tone for everything. Relations, economy, your whole world. You might liken it to somebody today who didn't want to participate. You know, if there were people then who didn't want to participate in slavery, you couldn't do that. Just like today, you might want to avoid being part of a fossil fuel economy and reduce your green footprint. And you can do that personally by walking and buying locally. But you live in buildings that were produced by things using fossil fuels. You probably wear clothes in some way. You probably eat food somewhere that was either transported by fossil fuels. And even if you have an electric car, usually fossil fuels have at least provided some of that electricity. And wealth that goes into churches and other things and to our country, in some ways come from that as well. You cannot avoid the economy. You are part of it. And that's the way life was in a slave economy. You could not own slaves. You could divest yourself of slaves, but you could not avoid the economy and the social relations that were inherent in a slave economy. Now, Alexandria was a slave town. Yes, there were lots of free blacks. And if you go on the city website today, you'll see how the population in 1860 was 12,652, and there were 1,415 free African Americans. You will not see the stat that there were 1,386 slaves. Our city was made up of African Americans who were both, some were free and some were slaves. And that had been the way it was since the beginning of census statistics. 1790, we had a population of 2,748, 543 of which were slaves. 52 were free. Now, over time, the population grows and the number of free slaves increases. And the number of slaves increases some, but eventually there are more free than slave in Alexandria. Okay, but there was still very much a slave economy. And yes, we were the location of one of the leading slave trading firms in the United States, Franklin and Armfield, down at 1315 Duke Street. You can go see their slave pens if you so want. Slavery was embedded into Alexandria. And the Episcopal Church had not escaped the economy either. Its members and its clergy had owned slaves from the beginning and throughout time and through the Civil War. During the colonial period, you were supported by taxes, and some of those taxes were paid based on the number of slaves you owned. So they earned the money that you paid on the taxes to support the church. And people gave slaves to churches, to endow churches, so the church could get funding on the basis of hiring out those slaves. And that went up until through the 19th century in some places. I have not found any evidence of that at Christ Church. People kept their slaves for themselves. But it was part of the church. And in 1860, in 2006, I did a study of the Virginia clergy resident here. I found 103 of the 112 resident clergy in the census records and determined of those clergy that 82 of those 103 owned slaves. That's a higher percentage than the population at large. That's the way life was. That's our background. The Episcopal clergy in Virginia were clearly a slave-owning class, and all of the bishops prior to the Civil War had owned slaves at least sometime during their life. Okay, that's your background. But we're here to talk about Christ Church. How did it function in this context? Well, the short answer, it was a majority white congregation with some African Americans. And I'm going to talk about the white folk and the black folk. And I'm going to talk about the white folk first, because there were more of them. They had the power, and they left most of the remaining records. You can find out about them more easily than the African Americans who did not produce records and for whom the whites did not collect the records to preserve until, frankly, in our lifetime. Okay. Now, were there slaves owned by the congregation? Well, how do I figure that out? We only have one parish register from the pre-Civil War days, and that covers 1828 to 1855. And its way of recording parishioners is challenging. Miss Lee, Mr. Lee. There were gobs of them, and then there were Masons and Lloyds and the same kind of problem. So I could not really go to looking at and studying the average parishioner. But there were two groups I could study, for whom we know who they were, and records can be found about them. The clergy and the vestry members. First, the clergy. In the pre-Civil War years, Christ Church had 13 13 different rectors. And amazingly, even they are hard to find the kind of documentation about their slave ownership. For this, you go to census records, you go to wills, you go to inventories of estates, you go to secondary sources, to biographies, you look at a whole host of sources. And having done that for these 13 men, I found definitive information about 7 of them. Our earliest rectors and our latest rectors. And those 7 owned slaves at some point. It is fully documented. And of those other 6, 4 probably owned slaves. They were from slave-owning families. They had grown up with slaves. They had grown up in slave-owning areas. I just have not been able to find them yet in the record to tell me yea or nay. There are 3 I have not found in the records, and 2 of them were New Englanders. From 1825 to 1861, we had 5 rectors. 3 of them were from New England. And I know one of them eventually owned a slave, Charles Dana, who was rector of Christ Church from 1834 to 1860. But he didn't acquire his slave until his last year in Alexandria, when he got married. He had lived basically in a boarding, as a boarder with someone. So maybe setting up his own household impelled him to have a slave to help his wife. I don't know. But that is the landscape of our clergy. The people who were preaching the gospel here were part of the slave-owning community. That's just the way it was. But the vestry. Fairfax Parish was created in 1765. We don't count the birth of our church until 1773, but we had our vestrymen, and they were only men again, from 1765 to 1861. During that period, there were 121 men who served on the vestry. Now you might say, well, that seems like kind of a low number. Well, keep in mind that once people went on the vestry, it was sort of a life sentence. There were people who, like Edmund Jennings Lee, Cassius Lee, who were on the vestry for 30 and 40 years consecutively. I know a present senior warden who goes, oh my gosh. But that's the way it was. So with these 121 men, I went and searched censuses, wills, inventories of estates, manumission databases, secondary sources, some Alexandria gazettes, to find evidence of whether or not they owned slaves. Of this 121, I located 105 so far. 103 of those 105 left evidence of owning slaves. Now, even if those other 16 I have not yet found did not own slaves, it would mean that 85% of our lay leadership from 1765 to 1861 were slave owners. That was the lay leadership of this congregation. What did that mean in terms of their life? How many slaves did they own? I'm not giving you numbers on that. I'll give you some general parameters. The vestrymen earlier in this time period owned more slaves than the people later, because the earlier vestry members were usually planters who had farms, who needed lots of slave labor, not just in their house, but in their means of livelihood. As you get closer to the Civil War, you have more vestry members who are living exclusively in the city and are professionals, lawyers, merchants, physicians, who were not farming the land with slave labor, but were staffing their homes with slave labor. And you need fewer to do that kind of work. So, yes, they were all slave owners, and they did the typical things that slave owners do. They advertised in the newspaper for runaways, offering rewards, such as, Richard Conway in 1799, or John Froebel in 1809, or Edmund Jennings Lee in 1812, advertising that their slaves had run away and offering a reward for their capture and return. Shades of Uncle Tom's Cabin? I don't know. They also advertised sale of their slaves. Yes, they didn't just keep them, they sometimes divested themselves of them. So they would run ads in the newspaper offering slaves for sale. And that was, for example, George Chapman in 1798 or Noblet Herbert in 1817. These are vestry members who did the normal business practice. You had excess employees. These you couldn't just stop paying them. You had to do something. You had bought them, you sold them. So you advertised for their sale. However, most of these people kept their slaves and kept them in their families. They willed their slaves. Their wills talk about, to my son John I give Sina and Jesse and Mambo and Sarah. They did not will anything of that nature to Christ Church. They didn't will anything to Christ Church. See why we need the Christ Church Foundation. Should have had it then. But they did not will their slaves to this institution, nor did they leave anything else. Only one willed something to a church. And that was to his parish where he was born in Ireland. So they kept their slaves and passed them to their families. And through their wills and inventories, you can find their numbers, which can go up to over 100 slaves. They were heavily invested in this form of the economy. Now, that is not to say they did not manumit some slaves. 22 of those 105 left evidence of manumitting slaves. If you go on the Alexandria website, particularly to the Black History Museum, you can find a wonderful godsend database of manumissions. And that tells who manumitted the slave, who was the slave, and some details as to why. Now, these people who had many slaves would manumit one or two, or in some instances, three. Some of them, like Noblet Herbert, or James Irwin, or Edmund Jennings Lee, would permit either the slave to hire himself out, acquire money, and purchase his own freedom, or to have, if this person was married to a free black, that free person would also earn money and pay for the freedom of their spouse. Now, a few others, like Robert Hu and Charles Broadwater, freed a couple of slaves in their wills, while willing the rest of them to their sons and daughters and nieces and nephews and wives. Two particular examples of these, and these are where I'm going to read you something. Charles Broadwater, who had been senior warden when the parish bought its glebe, and was in the founding era of the church, finally died in 1806, and the estate inventory listed 19 slaves. But in his will, he wrote, "It is my will and desire that my two slaves, Jesse and Judah, in condition of their long and faithful services at my death, be free and fully forever emancipated. But should it so happen that by their present or future ages it should be objected to the court of the county for fear of their becoming chargeable to the county in that case, I request and enjoin it on my two grandsons, George W. Hunter and Charles E. Broadwater, to cause to be completely effected my desire in keeping them, the said Jesse and Juba, free and clear of becoming in any manner chargeable to the said county, and that free and clear of requesting any service from them, or either of them, which expense, if any, thereon should accrue, is to be equally borne by them both," meaning his nephews. It was not easy to emancipate a slave. But this man wanted to honor two of his 19 slaves. To allow that, he was unusual. And another unusual vestryman was Robert Townsend, who, in his will, wrote, "So far as means in my power for releasing mankind from manacles and slavery has been given, I have thrown them off as soon as I perfectly understood the great, the benevolent command of God. Do as you would that men should do unto you. I emancipated every man, woman, and child in my power. But if any latent right still remains in me to the service of Hannah and her children, that I give and devise to my said counsel, Richard Harrison. But it is my last will and testament as to temporal matter, that he do whatever may be necessary to render them perfectly free, and that he do, in case any attempts be made to continue them in bondage, make use of every means in his power to prevent it. The 1809 inventory of Mr. Who's estate showed Hannah was still around, aged 60. She was old, the kind of slave that people liked to get rid of and not worry about. Hannah was sold, yes, to a buyer who could and did manumit her. These are two stories, two positive stories from our vestry's past, our vestry's ownership of slavery. But I couldn't find many more. Perhaps I will find additional stories as time goes on. But manumission was hard, and you were taking care of your family, just like you probably might will them your car, even though it increases somebody's carbon footprint. So these are neat stories, but more common were vestrymen like Richard Chichester, who owned 188 slaves and passed them on. Dr. David Stewart with 94. James Who of Burgundy with 25. John Froebel, the organist and vestryman, who owned 19 slaves. They all specifically devised their slaves in their wills to ownership by someone else. Few followed the path of Richard Who or Charles Broadwater. But what about the African Americans in the congregation? Mrs. Randle, what can you say about them? That's really hard going, because finding the sources where they are discussed is very difficult. So you start with the vestry minutes. From 1765 to 1861, African Americans make it into the vestry minutes 3 times, and only 3 times. 2 times into regard to where they were going to sit in the church. There's the 1803 map, which had them sitting in the back on the lower level. And in 1815, a committee was appointed to make such alterations in the seats for the colored people for accommodation as to them shall seem most advisable. And that's as seem most advisable to the committee, not to the African Americans. The decisions were not recorded. Now, there are many churches will say, oh yes, the galleries of the church were built for the slaves. That is not for Christ's church. Galleries were built from 1785 to 87 by special subscription, a payment for people who wanted a seat in the church. And I can tell you, they weren't the slaves. They did not have the funds. So these white people wanted seats here, and there were not enough. So that's how the galleries came to be. The only other mention of African Americans in the vestry minutes is in 1842, where a VTS seminarian was given leave to occupy the lecture room, and that was the old lecture room on that part of the property, to give religious instruction to servants, euphemism for slaves, of the Episcopal congregation on Sunday afternoon. That's the only hint we have of when African Americans might have had special gatherings, besides sitting in the back or somewhere else in the church. Now, how many did they have to teach? How many in the congregation? We go back to that 1828 to 1855 parish register, which does record official acts regarding African Americans. In a separate portion of the book, you had a segregated parish register. So, in between 1830 and 1855, 125 African Americans were baptized by the Christ Church clergy. Many of them happened at church. I don't know when at church, but at church, including one on the 12th of July, 1840, when a female servant of Mrs. Eliason was baptized in Christ Church by Bishop Moore. Bishop baptized one. Others were clearly baptized in sickness. It says so, much like regular white parishioners who were often baptized in sickness and fearing death, such as Benjamin, sick child of Lucy Harrison, who was baptized in private on July 7th, 1837. He was buried 2 days later. Lucy Harrison had at least 2 other children baptized at Christ Church. I do not know if Lucy was free or slave. You say, well, she has a last name. Well, many slaves had last names. You find them in estates, inventories, and in census records. Now, others were baptized in groups on plantations. The clergy went to Mount Vernon at least 3 times in 1844, 1847, and 1853 to baptize slaves among the Mount Vernon family. The Washington family, one of which had been a vestry member or elected but didn't want to serve, did take seriously religious instruction of their slaves. And then on November 22nd, 1849, they went out to Ravensworth in Fairfax County, the home of Anna Maria Fitzhugh, the widow of William Fitzhugh, and a very active parishioner. 22 slaves were baptized that day. I am sure Charles Dana got very wet. Others were baptized at the home of their masters, including vestrymen John Froebel and John Lloyd. So they were baptized, some free, some slave. The clergy also performed marriages for African Americans in the community. Some were free. For example, on October 31st, 1850, Delaney Burke and Sarah Jane Berry, free persons with license, that's a marriage license, were married by the Christ Church clergy. Others were not free. Some of them married across the free slave line, such as on Valentine's Day, 1839, Michael, servant of George Washington Parke Custis, married Eliza, a free colored woman. Or May 15th, 1855, Lewis Berry, servant of Miss Slaughter of Fredericksburg, married Nancy Doran, servant of Mrs. John Lloyd of Alexandria. The clergy did marry. Masters did give permission for the marriage. Quite how that stood up, I can't tell you. And then there are 16 burials recorded. The interracial aspect of the congregation was dwindling, however, as you get closer to the Civil War. From the parochial reports, we find out about communicant strength. Parochial reports are the annual report. The priest of the diocese of the congregation is responsible for sending to the diocese, and they are printed in the diocesan journal. It continues to this day, right, John?
Right.
And there we find information In 1835, the congregation, the communicant strength of Christ Church, those who took communion, was 120. 12 of those communicants were African Americans, 10% of the congregation. By 1860, however, that had changed. We had 142 communicants, but only 6 of them were African Americans. The communicant strength grew, but the numbers of African Americans communing declined. I can't tell you why. Could have been other opportunities. They could have gone with other denominations. I don't know. But we were becoming whiter. So that is what Christ Church was like, as far as I've been able to determine in the pre-Civil War years. When you look at it in the mid-1830s, where you had 10% of your communicant strength as African Americans, that's pretty good, particularly if we compare with Christ Church today. But what did that communicant strength mean then versus now? We don't know if those African Americans were encouraged to worship separately. We don't know if they had to celebrate communion separately. We do know they had to sit in a segregated area. We do know they could not exercise leadership. They could not be on a vestry. And we have had African Americans on the vestry in the last 20 years. Christ Church, 1773 to 1860, was an Episcopal church of its time and place. And that is all I can say.
I'm just wondering, it's been about an hour.
Oh my.
And I'm just thinking that maybe it may be time to call this session to an end. But I know that Ann Shine just wants to say a word or two. So we're going to... no rebuttal. If you would just step back, Ann is going to step in for 2 seconds, and then we're going to take a moment to recognize Julie.
How many of you were not here for the last Julie talk? Oh my, okay. So very quickly, I talked about Mary Custis Lee's bequest to Christ Church. She was Robert E. Lee's oldest daughter, very independent, traveled the world, and when she died, she left a very large, which would have been about $250,000 in today's dollars, bequest to Christ Church, the church that she loved so much as a child. And so fast forward to 2007, and it came to pass that Hunt Burke was down rummaging around, or for some reason into their vault, the basement of Burke and Herbert Bank, and they found 2 trunks of Mary Custis Lee's papers, letters, things. It seems as though she never threw away anything.
Thanks be to God.
Yes, indeed. Indeed. We love people like that. Which I find a wonderful closing to that story. But we talked a lot today about bequests. And as a lifetime member of this church, I grew up in this church, as many of you know, and it is very important that we continue that legacy of bequests to this church. It's the only way we're going to grow the foundation, from which the monies go to, and only, that's all we get to support the properties of this church. I would ask that if you have, and we've received several just because of, I think, a couple of weeks ago we talked about it, if you have left a bequest to Christ Church, Would you please make that known to either the clergy or members of the foundation? And thank you all very much.
Can we recognize Julia one last time for all of her? Our next presentation will be the Sunday after Easter at 9 o'clock here in the Mead Room. Good job.